So I would like to start just with a brief overview of what the IRB office is and what it is that we do here. Our IRB office at NC State, we are the place that reviews all research with human subjects for ethical and compliant practices. So if your work is going to involve getting information and data about a human, their thoughts, their feelings, their responses, etc., then you have to submit your proposal to us. We look for it for ethical practices, and then we approve your research to start. So we are a really good place to discuss ideas about inclusion, participant protections, and making sure that your design overall is promoting equity as it should be, right? That you are including the appropriate people that need to be at the table. Do you have any questions about what our office does? In this case, silence means no. Okay. Earlier today, I had the opportunity to start talking about ways to design your research with the idea of inclusion and equity in mind. And I'd like to go through the different topics of things that would help for your research design, which would then promote participant protections in the work that you're doing. I've broken it up into several different topics, and I provided the folks running the show here a document that they can send out to you. I got it to them a little bit late, so sorry about that. But the questions that we like to ask are around things like funding. You know, who's your funder? What do they stand for, and what are their values? And should they be associated with your project? And if they are associated, what's the message that that's sending out to folks? Do your research questions, do they promote equity and inclusion? Are your end goals of your research project going to be to provide solutions and strategies for inclusive practices? Are you specifically researching topics on inclusion or gender equity overall, right? And then if you are the way you're treating your participants, is it inclusive, right? Is it in an equitable format? Some of the stuff that I think is most important is all about your research methods. So what's the makeup of the research team? Who's at the table, who isn't at the table, and why? Do you need people to consult with you about how you're designing your research because there's such a single perspective in your research design because of who's at the table? Does the makeup of your research team, does that promote inclusion, you know, or what's the message that it's sending your folks? And do you have any blind spots about identifying risks to participants in this way? The things that we often will think about most, aside from how research is designed and who is at the table, is who are your study participants? Why are you targeting the people that you're targeting? Is it fair that you're targeting them and not others? If an abundance of people want to be a part of your research, a part of your research project, how are you selecting them? And is that in and of itself a fair way to go about it? Is your research going to benefit the participants directly, you know, or is it going to indirectly benefit them and maybe benefit society overall? And what are the risks to the participants, and is it worth the risk to them being in your study, or is it going to promote more disparity overall? Do you have any questions about that stuff, or anything come to mind for those topics? Okay, I'm going to try and share a part of my screen so you can kind of see the questions that I'm going through. I am, let's see if that works. So this is the document that'll be shared with you, or it can be emailed out to you all. And I really just go through what are the questions that you need to ask yourself. You'll see above here is where we talked about the ideas of funding or the research or how your research is designed, and getting into the makeup of the research team and your target population. But some of the more practical aspects are, where are you recruiting? Is the net that you're casting actually going to be reaching a diverse group of people, or is it accidentally leaving people out or over targeting some people? So for example, if you're only researching or recruiting for participants at a YMCA and nowhere else, that's going to really refine who your population is and potentially leave people out or lead to oversampling of others. What is it that your recruitment flyers are saying? And what are the messages that you're sending out? The images that you're selecting, the language that you're using. Are you using binary language or are you using inclusive language? So really looking at how you're designing your work, what you want that message to be saying is going to be important from the beginning of your process. When we think about the consent process, we think about consent in lots of ways. A lot of folks think that a consent process is really just someone signing a consent form, but honestly, that's actually the smallest part about it. The consent process is the opportunity for your researcher to talk, or for you as the researcher, to talk to participants about the study, get to know them, help them understand what's going on. And this means that you have to talk to them in a language that they understand, both in difficulty and in actual language that you're using, whether it's the participant's primary language. Maybe it shouldn't be a written consent form and they need to engage in an oral discussion, you know, so that you're culturally, you're not, I don't know, engaging in culturally offensive work. Maybe changing up how we do consent process can serve as a participant protection. Sometimes we don't want a title of a study directly linked to a participant's name. And so if you're thinking about how to be inclusive and how not to increase risk to participants, your consent process is going to be one of the main areas that you can really engage them. Everything from using, you know, non-binary language to making sure that you're facilitating that discussion in a manner that they get. Right? So if they aren't someone who can read and they can hear, you can read them through what's going on. And so there's a lot of ways that we can wiggle around and work with the consent process to make sure that it's inclusive and appropriate. Regarding your data collection methods, thinking about, like, if you're collecting data or physiological data, what are the cultural sensitivities that you need to be paying attention to? There's going to be issues around sex and gender. There's going to be issues around privacy. There's going to be issues around religious and cultural affiliations and who can touch what and be where and should see what and experience what. And we have to set the foundation for our participants to be able to know what they're getting into and provide a comfortable space for them to be in while they're sharing themselves with you. Right? Then also thinking about things like location and access. You know, is it easy to get to? You know, does someone have to come for 45 minutes and are we affecting their ability to get paid at a job? You know, can they actually get into the building? All sorts of things. And so when you sit down and you think about the practicalities of implementing your data collection, are you doing it in an accessible manner, both inclusive of people of different diverse abilities, but then also is the language that you're using and the topics that you're addressing, and are they all promoting a place where people can feel safe to come in and feel like they should be there? And that comes down also to language as well. And then the last bit is just, I think that's the most important, is just understanding who your participant population is and what information they're giving you. Remember, they don't have to be in research, and the fact that they're spending time with you to give you this information about them to help you publish or to help give information to this cause or whatever it is, they are choosing to give this part of themselves to you. So you need to make sure that you're designing the process for them as open as possible. And sometimes that means you need to be open to when they correct you. I know that was a little bit fast for us, but I wanted to make sure that I provided some opportunity for you to ask any questions while you have the IRB here, whether it's of me specifically or case study questions or any of that kind of stuff. And I'll leave this up so you can think about it a little longer too.
Hello.
Nothing?
Hi, I have a question. So I've just started on the IRB process for my first research project, and you mentioned funding, or like who was supporting the research. Is it common for people to have financial supporters for research? And if so, what does that look like?
It is really common. I would say the majority of the research that we do here at NC State is actually unfunded research, but it is really common. We do a lot of work where people have grants and sponsorships from everything from like the Department of Education, from NIH, from NSF, to some local sponsors or private companies. What happens there is they would apply for a grant like normal, and then if that grant were to be received or be awarded, that's when the IRB would work with the researcher to make sure that they had all the information they wanted. And in some cases, that includes disclosing that funding in the IRB application and in all the materials your participants would see.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. I can't really figure out how to stop sharing my screen, so that's just what's happening over here. Any other questions that you have? Maybe that's specific to your research, or, you know, Joy, did you see anything that came up earlier that I didn't get to address that you think would be beneficial now?
I have a question.
Sure.
If I am doing an educational program with K through 12 students, in terms of the consent process, is it okay to, when they're signing up, to just have like, you know, by signing up for this program, you're consenting to participate in research, or does it have to be a separate consent process outside of just the registration?
That's all going to be based on your research design. So some people design programs specifically for research. And if that's the case, then you would say, as a part, or in order to participate in this program, you have to participate in this research and you're consenting to allow us to use this information. Other folks use it to where they just want to potentially use it as research, so it's an optional thing. And then other people will have some parts that are for research and some parts that are for program. And all of that's going to be okay as long as that's what your research is specifically aiming to do. On our website, there's a really good form. It's called Research versus Evaluation. And on the first page, it's all about the difference between research and evaluation. But the second page is the one you'll like the best. We have fill in the blank language that you can use where it talks about the difference between research and evaluation. And in some cases, you can replace the word evaluation with educational program or program itself. And that'll give you the language that you need to have in your IRB application or your consent form so you can see what it is that we're getting at. And mostly it's just about defining the differences between the program and the research. And if there is none, that's when you would do a consent form like you talked about.
Okay.
Okay, so a question that was private messaged to me for you is how long are IRBs good for, and when do you have to have it looked at again if you're just moving along, just collecting your data? You know, when do you need to check in?
Sure. So there are 3 levels of IRB review. There's the one we all think of, which is called full board review. And that's the one that goes to a whole committee and everybody looks at it, gives you feedback, and you're typically thinking that's what happens. About 5% of the research here is that level, and it's unlikely yours will be that. And then if it is approved at the full board level, that means every year you submit for annual renewal for that approval. And anytime you would want to change something about your study, you would submit to us. Now, the other 2, they're called exempt and expedited. That's the mid-level review is expedited and exempt is the first level review. Neither one of those approvals ever expire. So that means that once you have IRB approval, if you don't change anything, you can keep that study going as long as that IRB approval or that IRB protocol said you could keep it going. So if you say that you're going to interview 20 people and you interview 20 people and you're done, the study's done. If you say you're going to interview 20 people annually for 5 years, that means when you get to that 5th year, you're done, right? So the approval doesn't ever expire unless it specifically says so in the letter, and there would be a reason as to why. Your obligations would be to submit any kind of amendments or changes to your study or report any problems that come up, and you can check in there.
Going off of that question, what if
Mhm,
someone is affiliated with NC State, for example,
mhm.
and gets IRB approval for a study, but then they themselves, as the researcher, moves on to another institution, but the study continues? Do you have to get another IRB approval, or does, the
Yep.
one you got
Your
previous?
IRB approval will follow you. So when you move, you would then have to contact your new IRB office, and they would decide what they were going to do. Let's say, for example, you had done all the data collection already, and now you're just analyzing identifiable data. The new IRB might say, "Now we'll just give you an IRB approval for analyzing, identifiable data because you had it for this." And so the IRB itself that you move to will be the IRB of record that will make that choice. And we have some good offerings at the library that talk you through a bunch of different nuances for the IRB. And we have like an IRB 101, a part 2, some nuanced stuff that will really get at some of these questions in more detail. But in general, the IRB approval follows the researcher. So if the researcher moves, they need to talk to their new IRB.
And maybe it would be helpful to discuss what kinds of things that might come up in, particularly in those exempt
Mhm.
categories that would need to update you and need reworking.
Sure.
Just
So if your study were to be determined to be minimal risk and fit into one of the 8 categories outlined in the regulations for exemptions, which are typically things like normal educational practices, surveys, focus groups, interviews, taste tests, oddly, if your study is approved under that, you would want to contact us if a problem came up, maybe a participant told you something that you feel like you need to report. You would contact us if an issue came up in some way, shape, or form. You would submit a request for a change if you wanted to change something. Sometimes a change to a study can change the level of review required because it changes that risks to participants, and that's where we want to be focusing. But usually, once you have an approved exemption, there tends not to be too many problems with those because they're so minimal risk. And if they are, they're usually around participant compensation.
And we should maybe emphasize that you can always just ask you, and that's a whole lot better to just ask and be
Yeah.
safe than.
In general, it's much better to be proactive, right? So we are fully aware that you're not taught to speak IRB and you're not taught to do the practical sides of research in the way that we require you to describe with us. So it's always okay to reach out to somebody in our office, and we'll talk you through the process. We'll help you understand. Sometimes we'll help make your research much better or help you come up with much easier ways to do things because we've seen quite a bit. And that I think ends up being more helpful for you in general. And sometimes I might even tell you you don't need IRB approval, which is like the best. So that's where it would end up coming out for you to reach out to be a little bit more easier. I would say maybe something before the time is up entirely is things to look out for when you're applying for the IRB is one, read through our website. We have great tutorials. But two, you want to make sure that your application matches your study materials. And then three, you want to make sure that when you talk about your participants, that you are writing to them in a way that they understand, that you're treating them like humans, that the paperwork that they're reading is written to them and not to us, that you use inclusive language. There's no reason to not use a they when you can use a they in a consent form, or a you. You don't need to be specific about pronouns or things like that. And in some cases, we can leave off certain pieces of information or titles if we think it will be offensive, or if it would make participants feel like they were at risks or increase risk to them. So we really want you to take an eye towards mitigating issues and not collecting information you don't need, but really making sure that your research design is participant centered. And if you need a second pair of eyes, you can certainly ask any of your colleagues or somebody who's in the participant group you're looking at, but you can also reach out to us and we can help you with that. Is there anything else I can do for you guys today? Okay. Well, you are welcome, Alexa. Joy, is there anything that you need from me?
No, just thank you so much for doing this in the morning session. It is just always a pleasure to hear you speak and talk about things. And thank you.
You're welcome. Enjoy the free 5 minutes.
My cat has she likes to attend all Zoom meetings.
I like it. I like it. It's great. All right, well, folks, enjoy your day, and please reach out if you have any questions, okay?
All right, thank you so much.
Bye.